Hello world, this is SpartyCast.
Hello and welcome to SpartyCast, brought to you by the Social and Psychological Research on Technology Interaction Effects Lab here at Michigan State University, the Sparty Lab. I'm director of the lab, Dr. Robby Ratan, and your host of this podcast. This is episode number 18. We are coming of age. The podcast is now an adult. It can vote. It can drive in countries where you're not allowed to drive until you're 18. It is also the chemical element number for argon, a noble gas, which is appropriate because our guest today is quite noble, especially with his wizard beard. Dr. Casey O'Donnell, an associate professor in my department, the Department of Media and Information at Michigan State University. Casey and I share many things in common in addition to the department and having an office on the same hallway. We come from STS, Science, Technology, and Society. That's what we called it. He called it Science and Technology Studies. Similar idea. This was my undergrad major, but he followed it more deeply into his graduate studies. The idea is that you can understand science and technology when you study them with science methods, social scientific methods. And that's important because those things influence society and society influences those things influence each other. Science, technology, and society are all intertwined. And Casey has applied this general idea to the study of video game production. He's studied tabletop gaming, fellowship games, generally in serious games. That's where he teaches game design at Michigan State. We have a top ranked program, thanks in part to him and the other great faculty in our department. So I'm very excited to have him on this episode, and I hope you enjoy it. I think it's relevant to students who might want to go into this field, to people working in games or technology industries who might be interested in the serious games certificate, or to anyone who is interested in the effects of games beyond just entertainment. So enjoy. All right. Hello to Casey O'Donnell, my friend and colleague. Welcome to the SpartyCast.
Hey, thank you, Robby. It's a delight, and been looking forward to it. So
yeah, so we started in the department around the same time. You joined in 2012, right? Late 2012.
Yep, I think you started 6 months before me, and you've had a sabbatical before me too.
Oh, totally not fair. But you got tenure before I did. And we've been on the path together. But you do different research, though. We're both in the general area of games and technology. You're a production studies scholar. Can you tell me about that background, how that happened?
Sure. So that's probably the strangest story, because it didn't really exist before me and a couple other people came along. And in part because I came from, so my PhD is in Science and Technology Studies from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And Science and Technology Studies is kind of a small field in terms of people who sort of called themselves that. And Science and Technology Studies is a field of research where you have anthropologists, sociologists, historians, and other social scientists studying science and technology, science production and technology production. And I wound up in a grad program. And at the time I was, I had worked in games, but I'd just worked in traditional software. And I was like, I want to study software production. And, at the time, there was kind of a small field of software studies and other stuff like that going on. And I kept trying to get into places to do field work, like as an anthropologist at these companies, to study the practice of making software. And nobody wanted to let me in. And I wound up having drinks with a friend of a friend, and he was a game developer, and we started capitulating about making games and just that process and how kind of chaotic it was and how nobody seemed to get any better at it over time. And he was like, well, maybe you can come to my company and study us. And, 3.5 years later, I finished my dissertation. And so that was pretty cool. And so my dissertation, I would say like in science and technology studies, lab studies was this kind of big thing where, an anthropologist or a sociologist would go hang out in a lab and study those people. And I just like tore that page out of the book. It was like, I'm going to go do that at a game company, which then became, and so there were other people like John Banks and Afra Kerr who were doing research by going out and talking to game developers. There were folks doing what I would call research around games, looking at production, but they were doing it more from a political economy perspective, and they weren't talking to developers. They were just sort of looking at the headlines and the news and like, oh, look, here's what's happening in the game industry, and we're going to study it from a political economic perspective. And I'm not dissing on any of that research, just that, actually talking to developers was not a thing that they were doing or being a part of those worlds. And so that's what production studies was asking social scientists and humanities folks to be a part of the world of game development and to study it critically and scholarly. And
that's
my dissertation. Go ahead.
That's your dissertation. Yeah, and to me it's so STS, which to me that was my undergrad major. As you know, we share that in common. Also, you call it science and technology studies. We called it science, technology, and society. But it's essentially the same field, and it as a field has become very popular. From what I understand, when we were doing it in the early days, I think it was quite new. But
we were the land of misfit toys. And then people decided that they thought the misfit toys were kind of cool.
Absolutely, because they, I guess, realized across the board, science and technology play such an important role in society, and there are mutual influences between all three of those pieces of this puzzle. And so we should study science and technology as an object in itself. And so you did that with game development, and then you transitioned into game development yourself, right? And so, yeah, can you take us there?
It became my way. So in some ways it started while I was at Vicarious Visions, because some people there introduced me to homebrew game development around the Nintendo DS. And homebrew game development is, people, just hobbyists working at home. But to make games for the Nintendo DS back then, you had to break the law. You had to break the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and buy a cartridge that was typically used for piracy, but you could be used to make games for it. And so I got back into making games because I wanted to study that community of people, hobbyists working in homebrew game development. And so I just started having fun with it. And, when I finished my PhD in 2008, like MSU was one of the very few programs that did games back then. MSU was really one of very few kind of pioneering schools that were like, yeah, we do games. And like, no, I had to be a new media person, right? When I first finished, because you couldn't be a games person, right? It was still such a young field that nobody wanted to, there were some places hiring games people, but they, and so I was a new media scholar. I just happened to focus on games as an example of new media. And so, but fast forward a few years after that, it became much more kosher. But one of the tensions for academics to study games is what a lot of the programs want us to be able to teach game developers, and studying games is very different than making games. And so for me, I get to do both. And that's my way of also staying part of the world of game development, because if I can bring STS and this kind of critical perspective into the classroom of people making games, that's actually where change happens, and like we can rethink what kinds of games are getting made. And so for me, it's just Elizabeth Wilson is a STS person who studies neuroscience, and she uses this phrase, inhabiting well, and that you can't just be critical and then be, sort of like write the book, be critical, chuck it out the window and walk away. The best way to be a part of that community is to stay and be a part of it. So that's for me why I do production studies still, but I also make games. And typically the games I'm making are related to what I'm studying over in production studies.
Such as friendship.
Friendship, well, yeah. So studying friendship because I started making games about friendship and relationships, and friendship is this kind of foundational kind of relationship for all our relationships. So my collaborator Hermione and I published a piece on dating games as well, right? Designing dating games. We've been working on a paper on designing friendship games and what kinds of mechanics and processes go into those things. And we found that it just kind of, non-digital games are a lot better at getting people to talk to each other than digital games are. And so we started making non-digital games, which then, sort of got me thinking about the non-digital game industry. And so then I started looking at that from a production studies lens, in part because non-digital games the industry of non-digital games looks and feels a heck of a lot more like the video game industry circa 1990, right? Because you got to actually have a physical thing, games now, everything's digitally distributed, but if you want a physical copy of your game, it's like, oh well, is it going to get produced in China, or where how are you going to do this? And it's going to show up on a giant pallet and it's going to be yay big, and what are you going to do with it? So
can you tell me a little bit about a specific research topic in the friendship game space, maybe Fellowship of Fools, which we looked at a bit together, or something else?
Sure. I mean, we should definitely talk about that, because I have a long history working on learning games, and I'm not trained as somebody who finds out if things really work. So working with you was a chance for us to take something that was using these principles based on social science research around friendship, right? Taking those principles and using those principles around friendship to design a game. And then we got to ask the question together, did it really work? Because for me, it's more like, well, I'm going to take the social science research around friendship, romance, and make a game based on those ideas. And I tend to not ask did it work? It's more like taking that and using those principles in the design context.
Yeah, so we ran a study. We had undergrads come into a big room and then sit down and play a game with a stranger, either your game or just a general icebreaker. I mean, I think we also had another tabletop game as a comparison.
Table Topics, which is one of the best-selling conversation games on Amazon.
We consistently found it was the worst at making people feel similar or have a potential friendship, liking each other.
I feel bad for them.
Sure. This isn't published yet or peer reviewed, but we'll work on that eventually. The icebreakers seem to do well in what we called the high depth condition, right? But high depth for an icebreaker is still relatively low depth compared to Fellowship of Fools, which, can you give us some examples of the types of cards you might get to discuss with your?
Sure. So, I mean, Fellowship of Fools is like kind of turned into a whole array of things. It started as wanting to make a dating game. But what we found is that for the most part, the reason that dating sucks so bad is because people are really bad at just having conversations and learning to be friends. And I don't know, the research shows that being friends is pretty important for romantic and sexual relationships and or sexual relationships. So, you know, yeah, friendship important for dating. And since like it's hard, and having conversations that you know, so friendship is often about sort of building rapport and disclosing, self-disclosure, and then reciprocal disclosure, right? You know, if I disclose something to you, I kind of expect you to give me something back, and it's not a tit for tat, but it's this cycle. So
the game is
FOS,
structured to facilitate that reciprocity.
yeah, and it's going to ask you questions that I think really get at more self-disclosure or more about who you are as a person. The other thing that Fellowship of Fools is designed really from the ground up as a queer game, and it disguises itself very well. But lots of the things that we do in terms of the way things are phrased, encourages people to not just answer the question, but kind of be self-reflective. So not just saying like, what's your family like? Because that's a relatively high disclosure kind of question. It would say, what does family mean to you? Which is a different kind of question. And lots of the questions are, describe a time when. So describe a time when you felt hurt, or describe a time you hurt somebody else. And like that, that's different than like, who's your best friend? Or who was your best friend growing up, which is a cool question, but different than, describe a time deep. Or like describe a time your best friend moved away, or, like those aren't really the questions that are in the deck. Sure. I could pull it up and, do you want to draw a card? I can pull a card.
Oh man, let's do it. Let's pull a card. Give me a high depth card. So high depth in Fellowship of Fools, we found might have been a little too high depth between strangers, at least according to our data.
Right. So a less depth card from Fellowship of Fools. This is the same card. So this is the Knight of Wands card. And so the easy prompt is, what is something you'd like to create? Which is, right? Okay, cool.
I'd like to create a podcast.
Right. I'd like to make some games. But the same card, the high depth question is, where might you be wrongly informed?
Ooh. I might be wrongly informed about how to create a successful podcast.
Hey, I've started talking to my students about, we need to redefine what success means, because if it just means like number of views or number of downloads, like, I don't know. Like I'd rather be super niche and have people who are like, you know what, this is like my favorite thing, and so yeah,
sure.
Success is an abstract concept.
Yeah. Well, as academics, we're resilient to repeated failure and rejection, hopefully.
And people not reading our stuff.
Exactly. But maybe someone will listen to this and get a chuckle and learn a bit about what it means to not only be a production studies scholar who focuses on games and makes games, but also just generally the type of work you can do in serious games. So you would define this as a serious game, focused more on just entertainment. There's an intent here about friendship. You said you worked with learning games. Of course, there are health games or political games. These are all kind of serious games, meaning beyond just entertainment, right? So, of course, this is me forcing a segue to talk about serious games.
Right, which is which is a really hard thing, right? I mean, and I think a lot of people in game studies, like there's this tension, right? Well, even in friendship games, people, the question was like, well, what's not a friendship game? And I'm like, Monopoly, like Settlers of Catan, when the robber moves around. Like, yeah, no, lots of games are not about friendship. Like that's the whole table flip thing, right?
Antagonism games,
right? Oh, I mean, Eve Online is not a friendship game. Anyway, but right. So, but what game isn't serious? So, there are serious games, and then there are not serious games. Well, so anyway, right, it's a complicated, and so I think when people talk about serious games, what they're really trying to get at is games who games that are designed with the hope for having impact, right, for having an effect, which, in and of itself is kind of a complicated thing, because a lot of people who work in the entertainment game industry, like, the idea that games have effects is kind of terrifying, because then you might actually have to be responsible for your game. So it's just a game, and it's never just a game, right? Yeah. So for me, serious games are about when people design things with the full intent and knowledge and ethical preparation for making things that they hope have impact. I mean, Robbie, why don't you, so like one of the complicated ones would be like empathy games. Some empathy games have been found to have negative effects, right? And they were designed with the hope and intent to have a good impact, right? But in fact, they sometimes have negative impacts.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you put yourself in someone's shoes and you don't want to be in those shoes, given the context, then that can actually strengthen or reinforce stereotypes about that type of person. We've seen that in lab studies. It's funny, you call lab studies when you go into someone's lab and study those people in the lab. For me, on the quantitative side, we call lab studies, we bring people into our lab and we study them. But yeah, we bring people in, put them in VR, and if they're in a different ethnicity and they're not in a comfortable context, it actually reinforces negative implicit attitudes about those groups. Though most of the research shows that as long as you avoid those kind of contextual issues, mismatches, you can avoid those negative effects. But you have to learn, you have to study it, right? It takes some thinking.
Yeah, so for me, I think it's really, so serious games are like, you have to take seriously that, on the one hand, I'm hoping to have this good impact, like, but you have to be careful and be responsible in the design and the testing, and right. So, doing a more participatory approach to design where you're getting people involved earlier, whereas, most entertainment games they're making a game that they want to make, and they hope it's going to be successful, but and more game companies do user testing and user experience, and they look at what other people are doing, and they use data models to see what keeps people engaged or whatever. They don't do a very good job if they're like, well, this game deals with mental health. Like, well, one, they probably wouldn't say that, but like, it would be different than, going and working with mental health professionals and people who maybe struggle with the issues that are in the game. And that's, for me, a serious games is when you're really taking seriously the topics that you're engaging with, and you're doing the homework. Like, you're being serious about it, which is just a little bit different in terms of valence. So, do we want to talk about serious games at MSU?
Yeah, exactly. Students who might want to come to our program, we've got a top 10 game design program, right? And then as a complement to that, we have a serious games certificate and program. Can you tell us about the structure of those?
Sure. Yeah. So our undergrad game development program is not as focused on serious games, but because you have overlap between the faculty, they're going to get at least a taste of it, especially if they take my classes. Yeah, so we've got we're in the top 10. We're the top ranked public institution in the United States for undergrad games, and we're in the top 15 for our master's program as well. And so the Serious Games certificate is separate from the master's program, but many people that come through our master's program also get the Serious Games certificate. So the Serious Games certificate is fully online. It's 4 classes. And we got a lot of industry professionals who are, people who make games in the entertainment world, but they want to learn more about how to, think about those serious effects. And so, as I said, it's a series of 4 courses. You learn some user research, you learn UI UX, but also how to do some of the research more like you do. Probably not as in depth as what you do, Robbie, but it's an intro to kind of that.
Yeah, just how to think about effects, variables causing differences and other variables, that kind of thing.
Yeah, how to, you know, use a cert, you know, so you test your game and you ask people questions before and then you ask people questions after, and like, you know, even just do that kind of user feedback, like what did you like, what did you not like, you know, how could this be different, were there parts of the game that made you uncomfortable, or, you know, all of those things. So
Yeah.
but yeah, like I said, it's fully online, and it's a great way for you know, if people are curious about serious games, it's a great way to engage with that.
Yeah, I think it's really amazing. Our department, I mean, let's just pat ourselves on the back here. We have such a cool mix of topics and scholars. Personally, I feel connected to many of the different areas, games and media research, media psychology. And I'm not a game developer, but Casey, you kind of straddle that boundary there, qualitative, quantitative. We've got a really interesting kind of interdisciplinary identity that I don't see in any other communication colleges or human computer interaction departments or programs, right? Like, is there anywhere else that does what we do like
I
this?
mean, you know, I mean, some people would say that there are, I mean, there are definitely connections, right, to lots of places that are either iSchools or, you know, but I think, you know, particularly, I hate, you know, there are lots of people in our department that have nothing to do with games. But I think one of it, but I think that's a real strength, because, like, you know, we have folks from human computer interaction, um, you know, communication, sociology, social psychology, like it's fabulous. But what happens is I think we start to talk to each other, and that changes the work that we all do, right? Having this, these kinds of conversations, right? So, you know, I just recently submitted a grant with Dave Ewaldson, you know, and with some of his collaborators from Alabama, and right, taking a game, a game that I worked on, and using that as a way to um, um, work with at-risk youth, and seeing if we can get them to, like, think and act differently. And right, so that kind of thing won't happen. I mean, sometimes there are those collaborations, but they're cross institution. And, you know, pre-COVID, we could just walk down the hallway and have that conversation. And, you know, sometimes it happens over Zoom now, but, you know, soon enough, I think those hallway conversations will happen. But it's much easier for me to, you know, get a hold of you and be like, Robby, does my game actually work? and then we can have that conversation, versus, you know, if we were strictly games focused, we wouldn't have that. And, you know,
Yeah.
something like the Quello Center, where it's like, well, if we're curious about, you know, you know, policy implications around stuff that's going on in games, I could just walk in there or email people in my department and start those conversations. So I think that's where we really do have strength.
Absolutely. And just some context there, Dave Ewaldson, who you're submitting that proposal with, is a prominent media psychology scholar, started the Media Psychology Journal back in the day, and is communication oriented like me, similar background, media kind of effects oriented. And so it's a great compliment. And you're right, there's so many potential synergies that are hard to find when you're just not at the water cooler, or even on Zoom meetings, but bantering before the meeting. Like that's a way to get, that's how we came to this podcast recording. It was kind of me saying, hey, I'm doing this thing on the side ish. And it would be great to have people connect. So and
I like to talk. I'll talk.
Don't we all, right? Like, maybe this is a good way to get to know colleagues. Last question, Casey. Serious games to serious avatars. Of course, I have to bring it to avatars. So you might remember the Proteus effect, this idea that avatars influence behavior. So that's pretty much it's an effect. It's an effect beyond entertainment. You can intend for avatars to influence people to be more professional. I just read a paper about how if you use an athletic avatar, they have a physio study where your heart rate is actually lower while you're doing the exercise. So and your perceived exertion is lower compared to a kind of less athletic avatar. So you can really influence behavior and outcomes through games, and in particular through avatars. What do you think about this domain, avatar effects?
So I'm also gonna for a moment remind Robby that when he went on sabbatical, I had to teach his class
Oh
on
yes,
avatars.
you did. We never circled back on that, so this is a good opportunity. Go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, right. Like oh, I mean, I totally believe it, right? But by the same token, right? Like if avatars can have positive effects, they can have negative effects, and that means you just got to take it seriously. So game developers out there, when we say we want more diverse avatars, the reason is because it matters.
Absolutely. And diversity, choice, control over the avatars people use.
I mean,
Avatars, go ahead.
not enough avatars have purple hair, man, and like especially on the ostensibly male like avatars. Is there a game that lets me be this? And the answer is mostly no.
And then like forget game. What about when I'm in my Zoom meetings and I want to use an avatar instead of my face because I want a little bit more privacy, a little bit more control over my appearance, a little bit more occlusion of things I don't want people to see. Like avatars are going to be common. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to stop my video for a second so we can see the image that I have when my video's off.
For you listeners out there, it's a still image of maybe not the most flattering, but a very funny photo of Casey, kind of mid-sentence, surprised, maybe a bit disturbed. I don't know what's going on. What were you reacting to?
I have a online asynchronous class that I teach, Games and Society, which is I love that class. It took from 2012 until the fall of 2020 for me to be able to teach that class. But of course, because it was fall 2020, we were in full-blown COVID. So I spent my entire summer recording all of these videos. And so I have all these great action shots of me because I'm, it's the class that I've always wanted to teach, right? Like it is STS meets games, and so I was super excited. So of course I get super passionate, which means that I like mid-sentence, I'm like,
and you use that. That's great. It's funny because I associate you with very cool photo shoots, like green screen background, holding game controllers like they're in a gun holster, and you're in the not the Midwest, the Wild West. And so that's a funny contrast there.
I mean, I think I have a hard time not being a bit of a character. And my students, particularly for 339, they feel like the lectures, right? The videos that they have to watch, they're like, it feels like a fireside chat with grandpa. And I'm like, oh, I'm old now. Like, I mean, I guess I am old, but like, I mean, the beard doesn't help.
It's
but
the wizard beard. Yeah, totally. But it's a great phrase, that you're a bit of a character, because right, that is an avatar, right? You are a character. You could be a caricature of the character that you want to present, or of yourself, of your identity. So I think you play very well with this notion of self-representation, and I think you have fun with it.
Well, I mean, so one of the things that I tell my students, right, is that the person they see either in front of a camera or in front of the classroom really isn't me. I mean, it is, right? Just like avatars. Avatars are part us, part not us. Like, but it's a presentation, you know? I'm a total introvert, and like generally speaking, I'm passionate about many things and I love to talk and chat, but you throw me in a room full of people, I'm gonna go to the people I know and be like, hey, can we talk? And like, this is weird. So, but I mean, come on, like once I started watching YouTubers, I was like, oh, like the way I can get students engaged is to also be that person. I mean, you have that too in your classroom, right? Like, think about you as teacher. It is this avatar.
Absolutely. And it turns the definition that we use of avatar on its head a little bit, because I always emphasize at some point there has to be a distinction between the self and the avatar. The avatar is a self representation, so it can't be the avatar itself. And so a picture of me, that can be an avatar because it's not me, but if you're looking at my body, that in theory shouldn't be the avatar. But in some ways, if I'm in character, it's not the self. Am I representing myself? Maybe I'm representing my ideal, my overt, my extroverted self. But then that's a part of the self. So at some level, it brings up the deep philosophical question of what is the self anyway? Is there even a true self? Certainly.
This is all in your class, man.
It's there. It's there. Yeah. Descartes' Error, the neuroscience oriented book from Antonio Damasio, basically says, this mind body duality is false. And so there are many selves. They're connected to our body and our neurological system. And yeah.
Yeah, see, I really like Deleuze and Guattari's work. There's so from the book Thousand Plateaus, there's a chapter called Wander Silver Wolves, and it's one of my favorite because it's the idea that I am pack. Like, I am not just one wolf, right? Like, and that we are all composed of pack. And so.
And it's hard to play alpha all the time.
And there is no alpha, right? Like, you know that, like, all that research was totally flawed research because they were studying, like, So yes, there is no alpha. There
is only like really about moments of confidence.
Yeah, and who's taking care of what? Like, I mean, real pack is family.
My internal family in my head represented by different avatars at different times. Whoa, this conversation went super deep and philosophical at the end here, but I think it was informative. I think students who are interested in our program and in working with you, Casey, will hopefully feel more comfortable reaching out to you about your research and your classes. So
I love talking. I will talk about this stuff any day, anytime. Like, my students, that they're like, you're super passionate about this. I'm like, yeah, why would I do this? Why would I choose this life if I wasn't passionate about it? So
absolutely. And students in the industry too, people who are working out there in game design and development, or avatar design and development, VR for the workplace. Our serious game certificate is very relevant, and Casey can take you through that awesome 4-class pedagogical experience. Thank you so much for listening. If you made it this far, thank you, Casey, for being with us.
Thank you, Robby.
Okay, that was our interview with Dr. Casey O'Donnell. I hope you enjoyed it. Isn't he nice? I like him. We've been friends. I remember interviewing him because I had been in the department for a few months before he was interviewed. And I remember thinking, wow, I'd love to be this person's colleague. We can be friends. And it happened. And we've kept a good working professional and friendly relationship for the past 9 years. Wow, time flies. And so I hope you can see why through that episode. He's very easy to get along with. He's a critical thinker. He's very intelligent, of course, and he's well versed in these topics of research. So yeah, I'm particularly struck there by the end of our conversation and how we can reconsider the ways we think about avatars and character and self-presentation. Of course, that's that's what a critical, qualitative scholar does for me, is to have me think about things in new ways, which is great. It's very useful. It's a testament to that idea that we were promoting about interdisciplinarity and how it's difficult to achieve. It takes a lot of effort to step across the boundaries, the hallway, but when you're literally stepping across a hallway, it's much easier than when you have to step across a campus or just a building even. And so I think our department is well suited for that. And I'm grateful to have colleagues like Casey, especially because they seem to be willing to join this podcast. And I'm even more grateful to you for listening, not just my mom, but to all the people who listen to this podcast. Of course, my mom's feedback is useful. It's good to have parents and family members and friends who are willing to invest in your publicly oriented endeavors. My mom's been editing my papers ever since, probably since I could write, but even into my career as a professor. This is a bit of a tangent, but I thought I'd mention her because she has been giving me good feedback on these podcasts. Thanks, Mom. And thanks to everyone. Thanks to my awesome team, George McNeil and Taylor Halterman, for helping to produce this podcast. If you like what you heard, please tell your friends, follow, subscribe. I mean, really, just hit subscribe. It's not that hard. It's just one button. Everyone tells you to do it, so you probably ignore it. You're not even hearing these words right now. But if you hit subscribe, then our little number goes up, and that makes us feel good about ourselves. It also increases the chances that we will be able to continue this endeavor into the future, because we can get sponsors who think that they will have an audience, and hopefully they will, because you've subscribed. Chicken or the egg. Anyway, hope to see you next time, where we'll be discussing something very interesting, totally worth your time, but I have no idea what it's going to be at this moment. Summertime, it's hard to schedule people, but we will have something for you. So take care and have a good rest of your week.
Thank you for tuning into SpartyCast. Goodbye, world.